Okay, so have you ever stopped and really thought about time? Is it this sort of independent thing flowing along, whether we're paying attention to it or not? Or could it be that it's actually built up out of our experiences of events, the stuff that happens? Like what comes first, the events or this timeline they seem to happen on?
That's a question that's had philosophers debating for, well, pretty much forever. But what's really interesting from the linguistic side is how our language, this tool we use every day, actually encodes our grasp of this very issue.
Hmm.
I mean, think about how we talk about stuff happening. Like we say something happened before something else, or that it's while something else is going on, or it's already finished.
Right, right. Like those little words before, during, after. They're doing a lot of heavy lifting when you think about it. And that's where these ideas of tense and aspect come in, right? Like they're the linguistic machinery we use to make sense of time.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're not just winging it based on, everyday chatter. You, our awesome listener, you pointed us towards a super in-depth resource. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on, you guessed it, tense and aspect.
Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to take this dense, complex philosophical material and distill it down to the good stuff. Those surprising, sometimes mind-bending perspectives that philosophers and linguists have come up with about how we think about and communicate about time.
So let's get right to it. First things first. Got to lay down the basics. When we talk about tense, one of the big distinctions is between absolute and relative tense.
Okay, so absolute tense, that's the kind of straightforward one, right? It's all about anchoring time to right
Yeah.
now. The present, past, present, future, it's all relative to this now point. So John promised, boom, that promise is in the past. I promise, happening this very second. The student will work, that's located in the future. Easy peasy.
Yeah, seems simple enough on the surface. But even within absolute tense, there's some sneaky complexities. Take the present tense. It doesn't always mean the action is going down right as you speak. Like if you say, John walks to school, it doesn't mean he's literally doing it as we speak, right? It probably means it's a habit, something he does regularly.
Ah, yeah, good point. Like a general truth about John, not necessarily happening at this very moment.
And then you have cases like, the train departs tomorrow at 5. Present tense, but is clearly a future event. This brings up a debate that's been going on for ages. Is will actually a pure future tense marker? Or does it have more to do with things like intention or prediction, like he will try to climb that mountain versus just the sun will rise tomorrow?
Ooh, I see. Will might be doing more than just pointing at the future. It might be coloring the event with possibility or certainty. Fascinating.
Exactly. And then you've got relative tense, where things get even more interesting. Instead of just comparing events to now, we're comparing them to other points in time, which themselves might be in the past or future.
Okay, so it's like layers of time, right? Time within time.
You got, the student had worked on his thesis,
Mm-hmm.
that working happened before some other point in the past, or I've lost my keys, that losing happened before now, but it matters now. And the student will have finished his thesis by next month. The completion is placed before a point in the future.
So absolute tense is this happened relative to this point, and relative tense is this happened relative to that point, which itself might be.
Much later to some other point. Yeah, it can get pretty intricate, but that's the beauty of it, right?
Yeah.
Language is capable of expressing all these subtle temporal relationships.
Absolutely. Now, on to aspect. You mentioned it's about the internal structure of an event. What exactly does that mean?
Right. So while tense tells you when an event happens relative to something else, aspect is more about how the event unfolds in time. It's like, is it complete? Is it ongoing? Does it happen over and over? Or is it this instantaneous thing? It's about the perspective you're taking on the event itself.
Gotcha. And we distinguish between lexical aspect, which is also called actions art, that's a fun word, and grammatical aspect.
Yeah, actions art, love that word. Basically, lexical aspect actions art is baked into the meaning of the verb itself, is how the verb inherently portrays the event in time. Grammatical aspect, on the other hand, is about how we use grammar to signal these different perspectives on the event, using, verb endings, auxiliaries, and stuff like that.
Okay, cool. So let's talk actions art. What are the main categories we should be thinking about?
All right, the Stanford Encyclopedia goes deep into this, building on this influential framework from Wendler, which has been super important in both linguistics and philosophy. First up, you've got states. These are the kinds of situations that just, are. They don't really have a beginning or an end built into them. Think, no, be beautiful, believe. They just hold true for some duration.
Like right now, I'm sitting. That's a state. It's just a fact about my current existence.
Yep, exactly. Then you've got activities. These are processes that unfold over time but don't necessarily have a specific endpoint, like run, swim, walk. You can do these for a while, but there's not some inherent point where you're like, okay, I'm done running now.
So a state is static, and an activity is dynamic but doesn't have a defined finish line.
Precisely. Next, you've got accomplishments. These do have a built-in endpoint, a goal. It's a process that leads to a specific result. Think cross the street, draw a circle, paint a picture. These actions have a natural point where you're like, yep, I did it.
Right, like the crossing, the drawing, the painting, they're processes, but they culminate in a definite outcome.
And finally, there are achievements. These happen in a flash, the emphasis being on the moment of completion. Recognize, reach, find, it's like, bam, it's done.
So an achievement is like an instantaneous transition from not X to X, whereas an accomplishment has this whole process leading up to it.
Exactly. And often linguists throw in a fifth category, even quicker than achievements, semifactives. These are your flash, spot, blink, super short, single occurrences.
Got it. Now, the encyclopedia entry talks about this event nucleus idea. What's the significance of that for philosophers thinking about how events work?
So the event nucleus, as proposed by Moens and Steedman, it's like this handy framework for understanding how all these different actions are and relate to the different phases within an event. They say you can analyze an event into three possible parts: the preparation, the culmination, and the consequences. And different actions start and emphasize different bits of this nucleus.
Like a recipe with different ingredients, and some recipes highlight certain ingredients more than others?
Exactly. States mostly focus on the consequences, the situation that just is. Activities are all about that preparatory phase, the ongoing process. Achievements are bam, culmination, and its immediate result. And accomplishments, they cover the whole shebang, the preparation, the reaching of the endpoint, and the resulting state. It helps us break down the temporal structure in a really fine-grained way.
Super helpful. So, okay, how do we actually figure out which action start we're dealing with in real life? Are there, like, linguistic tests we can run?
Oh, totally. Wendler and others, they came up with these diagnostic tests. One big one uses the progressive form, sarming in English.
Right.
Usually only non-stative verbs work with the progressive. Like, you can say Sam is running or Sam is writing a letter, but Sam is knowing the answer just sounds off, right?
Yeah, states are about just being something, not actively doing something over time.
Right. Another test uses time adverbs. Accomplishments love hanging out with in adverbials. Sam wrote a letter in an hour. Activities prefer for adverbials. Sam swam for an hour. And achievements typically like in, Sam reached the summit in 5 hours, but not so much for.
So in often points to reaching a boundary, like finishing a task, while for is about duration within some time frame.
Exactly. Now, there's also this test that looks at entailment patterns with the progressive. This leads us to the imperfective paradox.
Uh-oh, paradox alert. Lay it on me.
So if you say John was pushing a cart, it usually implies he did, in fact, push the cart at some point.
Yeah.
But if you say John was building a house, it doesn't necessarily mean he finished building the house. Maybe he got interrupted or something.
That is weird. Why does the progressive guarantee the pushing happen but not the building?
That's the million-dollar question. It shows that our understanding of ongoing actions and their outcomes isn't always straightforward, logically speaking. And that's been a huge motivator for a ton of theoretical work in this area, which we'll get into soon.
Yeah, that paradox really exposes the cracks in our assumptions about time and language. But first, the encyclopedia points out that the action start of a verb isn't always set in stone. The surrounding words, the context, can actually change it. That's called aspectual coercion.
Aspectual coercion, yeah. It's like the linguistic context is messing with the verb's inherent meaning.
So give me an example. How does this coercion thing actually work?
Take drink. By itself, it seems like an activity, drink wine. But if you say drink a bottle of wine, that little phrase, it creates a boundary. Now, the drinking has a definite endpoint, the bottle being empty. It's gone from an activity to an accomplishment.
Ah, so the noun phrase is lending its boundedness to the verb phrase, turning it into something with a clear ending.
You got it. And you see the reverse, too. Arrive is usually an achievement. Bam, you're there. But visitors arrived all night? That turns it into something more like an ongoing activity.
Whoa, so the verb's inherent flavor isn't fixed. It can be influenced by its linguistic buddies. That's wild. And the example of she is resembling her mother more and more every day, that one's mind-blowing. It takes a stative verb, resemble, and turns it into this ongoing process, almost like an activity. And Pellini played Opus 111 for 2 weeks, taking an accomplishment, playing a piece, and stretching it out over time with that time adverbial that's also super interesting. It really shows how meaning is fluid, built on the fly, not just pre-programmed in our heads.
Exactly. Meaning isn't static. It's built in real time through the interplay of words and context. This brings us to all the theoretical frameworks folks have come up with to try and formalize these intuitions and tackle puzzles, like, that pesky imperfective paradox. The encyclopedia outlines a bunch of them.
All right, time to get theoretical. First up,
Temporal logic. Now, I remember seeing those symbols, all those squiggles and letters. What's the deal with those? Yeah, you're talking about those fancy logical operators. Those are our tools for reasoning about time in a precise, formal way. Kind of like modal logic, where you have symbols for possible and necessary. Temporal logic has these operators for expressing temporal relationships. Always in the future, always in the past, at some point in the future, and at some point in the past.
So we can build logical formulas that capture different tenses and temporal relations, like John will work, John worked, and so on.
Right. And these formulas, they get their meaning from a model of time, which is like a mathematical picture of how time works with moments, maybe intervals, and a relation, like earlier than. The cool thing is, some logical principles that hold in regular modal logic might not work in all temporal logics. It all depends on how you define that earlier than relation.
So the logic of time has its own unique quirks, its own set of rules.
Yep. It's not just a straightforward application of modal logic. Time brings its own baggage to the logical party. Now, next up, we've got Reichenbach's framework, which brings in these ideas of speech time, event time, and reference time.
This one seems less about pure logic and more about how we use tense in actual communication.
That's a great point. So Reichenbach and later Comrie, they said, look, to really understand tense, we need to keep track of three things. When is the speaker speaking? Speech time. When did the event actually happen? Event time. And what point in time is the speaker using as a reference point? Reference time.
Okay, so let me see if I get this. With the simple past, like I saw John, the event time, the seeing, and the reference time are both before the speech time. Now,
You got it. But with the present perfect, like I have seen John, the event time, the seeing, is before the reference time. But the reference time is the same as the speech time.
that explains why the present perfect often feels like it has this connection to the present. It's because the reference point is now.
Exactly. The reference time sets the stage, tells you where to focus your temporal attention. And the encyclopedia points out this cool thing. The present perfect in English has this present relevance that the simple past doesn't always have. Like, I have lost my watch, but I have found it again. That sounds weird. But yesterday I lost my watch, but I found it again, totally fine.
Right. In the first one, it's like, if you found it, why are you still talking about losing it? But if you anchor it to yesterday, then it makes sense.
And another example, Chapman breathed a sigh of relief, kind of out of the blue on its own. But if you say, when he finally reached the summit, Chapman breathed a sigh of relief, now it fits perfectly. It's all about establishing that reference time.
Yeah, like you need that temporal context, that reference point to make sense of the event. And that table showing the different configurations of speech time, event time, and reference time for different tenses that really helps clarify things.
It's a super useful tool for visualizing those temporal relationships, but it's not a catch-all, More complex sentences, especially with multiple clauses and stuff, might need a more sophisticated analysis.
Okay, fair enough. Now, let's get into some seriously deep philosophical territory. The idea of building time itself out of events. This totally flips the script on how we usually think about things. And it ties in with that whole debate about whether instants are even real things.
Yeah, this is where things get really mind-bendy. Instead of assuming there's this pre-existing timeline that events happen on, this view, championed by folks like Russell, Wiener, and Camp, says, hey, maybe our whole notion of time, including those instants, is actually constructed from the relationships between events.
So the fundamental building blocks aren't moments in time, but events themselves. And time as we know it emerges from how these events relate to each other.
Exactly. Camp built on Russell's work and said, okay, let's start with an event structure. It's just a bunch of events and two basic relations between them.
Yeah.
Precedes, meaning one happens before the other, and overlaps, meaning they're happening at the same time, at least partially.
So it's all about precedence and overlap, and then we build everything else from there.
Yep. But there are rules, of course. Camp laid out a set of axioms that these precedes and overlaps relations have to follow. Like, if event X precedes Y, then Y can't precede X. That's asymmetry, and you have transitivity. If X precedes Y and Y precedes Z, then X has got to precede Z. And for overlaps, it's got to be reflexive, and the event overlaps with itself, and symmetric. If X overlaps Y, then Y overlaps X, and a bunch of other clever rules to make sure things stay consistent.
Okay, so we've got these basic rules governing how events relate. How do we get from there to the idea of an instant in time?
Well, in this framework, an instant isn't some infinitely small point. It's defined as the biggest possible set of events that are all overlapping with each other, like a bunch of events happening simultaneously. Any events linked by precedes have to be in different instants.
So an instant is a cluster of events that are all happening at the same time. And then the earlier than relationship between these instants is based on the precedes relation between the events within those instants.
That's the idea. And the amazing thing is, it works. Theorem 1 proves that this construction gives you a strict linear ordering of instants, its asymmetric, transitive, and total, just like our intuitive notion of time.
So you start with events, and boom, you get a timeline. And Corollary 1 says that each event corresponds to a chunk of time, a non-empty interval on this constructed timeline. So the events we experience are still grounded in this derived temporal structure.
Exactly. It all comes full circle. It's this beautiful, counterintuitive way of thinking about time. Maybe our concept of a timeline isn't the starting point. Maybe it's the end product of how we experience events.
Seriously mind-blowing stuff. It suggests that maybe events aren't just happening in time. They might be what time is. Now, let's get back to that imperfective paradox, the whole was pushing versus was building mystery. The encyclopedia looks at several attempts to crack this nut.
Right, and one of the most influential is Doughty's modal approach, which uses this idea of inertia worlds. Might resonate with you, given your philosophical leanings.
Inertia worlds. Sounds intriguing. What are those?
So picture this. You've got possible worlds, right? Worlds that are just like ours up to a certain point. After that, who knows what happens? But with inertia worlds, we're only interested in the continuations that are like the most normal, expected ways things could unfold.
Okay, so it's about the most likely ways the story continues, assuming no crazy curveballs.
Yep. Doughty's rule for the progressive is that it's true if, in all these most normal continuations, the event actually happens.
So, like, Mary was crossing the street is true if, in all the most likely scenarios, she ends up on the other side.
That's the gist. Now, to explain the difference between activities and accomplishments, Doughty adds some extra conditions. Activities, he says, have this subinterval property. If an activity holds over a certain period, it also holds over any chunk of time within that period.
Makes sense. If I was running for an hour, I was also running for any 10-minute stretch within that hour.
But accomplishments, they've got this more complex structure with an activity part, a result state, and a causal link between them. Like, Mary drew a circle. You've got the drawing activity, the result of a circle existing, and the drawing causing the circle to come into being.
Okay, so with accomplishments, there's this whole chain of events.
Right. So Mary was pushing a cart implies she actually pushed it, because pushing, by its nature, likely continued and resulted in some pushing happening in those inertia worlds. But Mary was drawing a circle doesn't necessarily mean she finished, because even if she was drawing in all those normal continuations, something could have stopped her before the circle was complete.
So accomplishments are more susceptible to being interrupted before they reach their goal. Makes sense.
Exactly. But in the encyclopedia points this out, there are problems with this whole inertia worlds thing. Like, what if Mary is crossing the street and a truck is about to hit her? Or she's running across a minefield? Those aren't exactly normal continuations.
Yeah, defining normal is tricky. What's normal in one context might be totally insane in another.
Right. It highlights the limits of trying to capture real-world expectations in a neat, formal system. The encyclopedia also mentions some debates about how intentional the progressive actually is, with mixed results from different linguistic tests. And then there's Parsons' extensional approach, which ditches the possible worlds and instead quantifies over eventualities, and uses predicates like cull for culmination and hold for being in the preparatory phase.
Okay, so instead of looking at possible worlds, Parsons is focusing on the events themselves and whether they reach their endpoint or not, and that avoids the whole inertia worlds dilemma.
Exactly. It sidesteps some of those tricky modal issues. But of course, there are criticisms of Parsons' approach too, like he doesn't really give a strict definition of what cull and hold mean, so it can feel a bit hand-wavy. And there's some counterexamples that are hard to explain.
Always a counterargument lurking around the corner. Philosophy, eh? Never a dull moment. But this back and forth is actually super helpful for understanding the different ways people have tried to model these subtle aspects of meaning.
Absolutely. It's about appreciating the complexity of the problem and the different angles folks have taken to try and solve it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Now let's talk about how the meaning of nouns can actually influence the aspect of verbs. This is where things get really interesting.
Right. This is about how the quantity and boundedness of a noun phrase can affect the action start of the whole verb phrase. And this guy, Krifka, he came up with this super cool framework called mereological semantics to explain it.
Mereological semantics, that's a mouthful. Break it down for me.
Mereology, it's basically the study of part-whole relationships. And Krifka's big idea is that objects, events, and time intervals, they all have this shared structure in terms of how they're made up of parts.
So we can talk about parts of things, parts of events, and parts of time in a unified way.
Exactly. And Krifka introduces these terms, cumulative and quantized, to describe how predicates, like adjectives or verbs behave with respect to these part-whole relations. A cumulative predicate applies to the sum of its parts. Like wine, if you have some wine and add more wine, it's still wine. But a quantized predicate doesn't apply to the sum of its parts, like a bottle of wine. 2 bottles of wine doesn't equal a bottle of wine, it equals 2 bottles of wine.
Okay, so cumulative is like adding stuff together and it stays the same kind of thing, and quantized is like the whole is different from the sum of its part.
You got it. And the cool thing is, this maps onto verb phrases too. Cumulative nouns tend to create atelic, unbounded verb phrases like drink wine. Quantized nouns tend to create telic, bounded verb phrases like drink a bottle of wine. It's like the boundedness of the object infects the verb phrase.
So the noun is like, hey, verb, I've got boundaries, you get boundaries too.
Exactly. And the way this works has to do with thematic roles, like agent and theme. Krifka came up with this concept of summativity for thematic relations, basically a way to formally connect the part-whole structure of the event to the part-whole structure of the things involved in the event. It explains how the aspect of a verb phrase can be figured out from the properties of the noun phrases it hangs out with.
It's like this intricate dance between nouns and verbs where the noun is leading and the verb is following.
That's a great way to put it. It shows how meaning is built up in a very systematic, compositional way.
Super cool. Now, the encyclopedia tackles this potential issue with event semantics, making it play nice with compositionality. The idea that the meaning of the whole sentence is built from the meanings of its parts.
Right. Some folks worried that if you treat events as these separate things you quantify over, it messes with compositionality.
Right.
Like, how do you deal with negation, quantifiers, all those logical goodies?
But Champollion swoops in with this idea of type shifting, right? Like changing the basic semantic types of verbs to explicitly include events, and everything works out.
Exactly. Champollion said, look, we can adjust the semantic type of verbs so they essentially come prepackaged with this there exists in a bit. It's a subtle change, but it makes a huge difference. Now, you can have sentences like, it is raining, and more importantly, sentences with quantifiers like John kissed every girl make sense in a compositional way. The quantifier for the girls can interact with the there exists a kissing event part without breaking anything.
So with a bit of semantic tinkering, Champollion shows that you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have events and compositionality living happily ever after.
Exactly. It's a major step forward in showing that event semantics can be a fully fledged member of the compositional semantics club. Now, getting a little more technical, the encyclopedia dives into how the event calculus, which comes from the AI world, tackles the imperfective paradox.
The frame problem in AI, that whole thing about representing what doesn't change when something happens, it always seemed really abstract to me. How does it relate to the imperfective paradox in language?
So the idea is the imperfective paradox can be seen as a specific case of this broader frame problem. The event calculus, which builds on this thing called situation calculus, it's like this logical toolkit for representing actions and events and how they change the world. You have predicates like initiates, terminates, holds sat, happens, basically.
Yeah.
Ways to talk about what's true at different times and what events cause what changes.
Okay, so it's a formal way to describe, like, this happened, then that happened, and because of that, this is now true.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a key part of this is inertia, the idea that things tend to stay the same unless something explicitly changes them. And the classic example of the frame problem in this setting is the Yale shooting scenario, where you have to figure out if a gun is still loaded after a bunch of stuff happens, even if nobody explicitly unloaded it.
Ah, so it's like, how do you represent all the things that don't change, all the things that stay the same, without having to list them out explicitly?
That's the challenge. And in AI, One way to deal with this is to use something called the completion of a logic program. Basically, you assume that the only things that happened are the things you're told about, or they can be logically deduced. It's a kind of closed world assumption.
So if nobody said the gun was unloaded, we assume it's still loaded.
Exactly. And the cool thing is, you can incorporate tense information into this event calculus too, using Reichenbach's ideas of speech time, event time, and reference time.
So instead of saying this happened at time t, we can say this happened before now, or this happened after that other thing.
Yep. And the system can use this information to build a consistent model of what happened, kind of like solving a puzzle. If you say, the gun is loaded, the system might infer that someone must have loaded it at some point in the past to make that true.
So it's like a detective piecing together a timeline of events based on the clues.
Exactly. Now, to handle the imperfective paradox, the basic event calculus gets some upgrades. They add predicates for continuous change, like releases and trajectory, which lets you represent events that unfold over time, not just instantaneous changes.
So you can model things like running, which takes a while and involves continuous change in your position, and not just events like flipping a switch, which happen in an instant.
Right. And with these additions, you can represent the meaning of run a mile as a process with a beginning, a continuous change in distance, and a condition for when it's done, you've run a mile. Run would be similar, but without that specific endpoint condition.
Okay, so you're capturing the difference between activities and accomplishments and how you formally represent them.
Exactly. And when you have a past progressive sentence like, John was running a mile, the system is basically checking if the running activity was true at some point in the past. And the system knows that running a mile could result in reaching that 1 mile goal. But if you add something like, when he was hit by a truck, that truck event can interrupt the running before it's finished.
So the truck event is like a wrench thrown into the works, messing up the nice, neat plan of running a whole mile. It's non-monotonic, right? New information can change our conclusions.
You got it. The event calculus captures this idea that accomplishments in the progressive don't guarantee completion, and it does it all within a logical framework. No need for possible world or vague notions of inertia.
It's amazing how this tool from AI, designed for reasoning about the physical world, can shed light on the nuances of how we use language to talk about time.
Right. It shows that there are deep connections between these seemingly different domains.
Absolutely. And speaking of connections, the encyclopedia also dives into the cognitive aspects of tense and aspect. This is where linguistics meets psychology, what's going on in our minds when we process these temporal concepts.
Yeah, this section is all about whether these linguistic distinctions, action certain, effectual coercion, grammatical aspect, whether they actually matter for how our brains understand language in real time. And research suggests, yeah, they do. Like studies on event perception show that our brains naturally chunk up continuous activity into discrete events, often organized hierarchically. It's like our minds are already primed to think in terms of events as these basic building blocks of experience.
So event might be a fundamental cognitive category, not just a linguistic one.
Exactly. And there's evidence that our brains handle different actions certain differently, like accomplishment verbs seem to be a bit harder to process than achievement verbs, maybe because they have this more complex temporal structure with both a process and a result. Studies on effectual coercion, where the context forces you to reinterpret a verb, have had mixed results, though. Sometimes there's a processing cost, sometimes not. It might depend on the specific type of coercion or the way the experiment is designed.
So our brains might be flexible in how they handle aspect, waiting for more information before committing to a specific interpretation.
That's one possibility. There's this idea called effectual underspecification, which says that our initial processing might not always decide on a specific aspect right away.
Kind of like our brains are saying, hold on, let me see what else is going on here before I commit to a specific understanding.
Exactly. And then there's grammatical aspect, the difference between, say, the simple past and the progressive. Psycholinguistic research suggests this really matters for how we mentally picture events. The progressive seems to make the participants in the event more prominent and highlights the ongoing nature of the action, whereas simple forms might focus more on the completed event and its consequences. There's even evidence from eye-tracking studies, where people look at different parts of a scene depending on the aspect of the verb they hear.
Wow, so aspect isn't just a grammatical quirk, it shapes how we attend to and represent events in our minds.
And there's even neurophysiological evidence from ERPs that suggests we might have this default expectation for accomplishments to be completed, but this can be overridden if the context says otherwise. which lines up with the idea that the inference you make with the imperfective can be canceled.
So our brains are making predictions about how events unfold, and then revising those predictions based on the linguistic cues we get. Expert.